The bikers laughed at the elderly black woman's marked skin, treating her fragility with disdain. But when they heard her make an unexpected phone call, their smiles disappeared, and the entire gas station held its breath, realizing that this supposed weak link was, in fact, the link that would destroy them. Martha Johnson walked along a dusty road in Riverstone, Virginia. She moved slowly because her knees hurt, but she kept going. The late afternoon sun felt hot on her back. She wore an old jacket and carried a small can. She needed kerosene for her home. The gas station sat ahead, a few hundred feet away. She could see 3 men standing near the pumps. Their motorcycles were parked in a line. They wore worn leather vests and heavy boots. Martha approached the pump where she knew they kept kerosene. She did not look at the men at first. She wanted to get in, fill her can, and leave. She heard their voices. They talked loudly and laughed at nothing in particular. She kept her head down and held the can with both hands. One of the men turned and stared at her. He was tall, with a shaved head and a wide jaw. His vest had a patch that read, "Hammer." He said nothing at first. He just watched her approach the kerosene pump. Martha stepped closer. She smelled gasoline and old rubber. There was a slight sheen of oil on the pavement. She ignored the men for a moment and lifted her gaze to the handle of the kerosene pump. "Hey," said Hammer. "You lost, old lady?" His voice had a rough edge. Martha stopped and looked at him. She cleared her throat. "I need kerosene," she said. Her voice was steady but quiet. "I just want to fill my can and go." The 2 other men leaned against their motorcycles. One had long, greasy hair and a scar near his left eye. The other was shorter with a thick beard. They looked at Martha and started to grin. The tall one, Hammer, stepped closer to the pump and blocked her path. "You come here often?" Hammer asked. He sounded amused. "Maybe you should find another place." Martha tightened her grip on the can. She tried to keep calm. She needed that kerosene. She tried to step around him, but he shifted to block her again. His boots scraped on the ground. "Please," Martha said. "I just need a little bit." Her voice sounded thin. She tried to keep it firm. She remembered her days as a combat nurse, patching up wounds in Vietnam. Back then, she had strength and speed. Now, her knees ached, and her back felt stiff. The man with the scar smirked. "You hear that, Hammer? She just needs a little bit." He spoke in a mocking tone. "What's your hurry, Grandma?" Martha raised her head and met Hammer's eyes. "I'm not looking for trouble," she said. She wanted to keep things simple. She could feel her heart pounding. "I just want to fill this can and leave." Hammer glanced at the other 2 men. He shrugged and then turned back to Martha. "Trouble?" He paused, then suddenly grabbed an oil can from the ground beside a pump. He tipped it slowly, letting oil spill across the pavement in front of her. It made a small dark puddle between them. Martha took a step back to avoid the oil. Her left knee twinged, and she almost lost her balance. The men chuckled. She tightened her jaw. She tried again to reason with them. "Stop that," Martha said, trying to sound firm. "I don't have time for games." The shorter bearded man pretended to look shocked. "Look, Hammer," he said with a grin. "She's telling us what to do." Hammer looked Martha up and down. He made a low sound with his tongue and teeth. "You don't give orders here," he said. "This is our spot." Martha swallowed hard. She realized she would not get kerosene today. These men would not step aside. She glanced at the road behind her. It was empty. No one was coming to help. She tried once more. "I'm old," she said quietly, "but I'm not helpless. I served in a war." She lifted her chin. "I deserve respect." The man with the scar laughed. "You hear that, Hammer? She fought in a war. Must have been a long time ago." Hammer stepped closer, forcing Martha to take another step back. The oil made the ground slick. She felt cornered. She smelled sweat and old leather from his vest. "Respect?" he said. "Not today, lady." Martha breathed slowly. She could not afford to fall. She could not fight these men. She tried to think of another way, but there was none. She looked at the pump handle, just a few feet away, blocked by their bikes and bodies. "It's time for you to leave," Hammer said. His tone was flat. He gestured with his chin toward the road. Go on, get out of here. Martha's hands trembled on the can's handle. She tried to hold her ground, but her knees hurt, and her throat felt tight. She had no choice. She took another step back. Fine, she said, her voice low. I'm leaving. The three men watched as she turned around. They did not move aside. She had to walk back the way she came. She gripped the empty can and walked away, head down. Their laughter followed her. She heard them muttering something she could not understand. She did not care. She wanted to reach home and lock the door. As she left the station behind, she kept her eyes on the road. She could still hear their voices. She could still smell the oil. She could feel a tight knot in her chest. Her pace was slow, and each step sent a dull ache through her legs. She would have to find another way to get kerosene, maybe another station, maybe another day. Right now, she felt small and tired. The men's laughter echoed in her mind. She gripped the can harder, as if trying to squeeze out the frustration. She reached the corner and turned. The sound of the motorcycles faded. She was alone again with her pain and her thoughts. She kept moving, not looking back. The day felt heavier now. She did not get what she needed. She had to find a solution, but right now she felt stuck and bitter. Martha reached her front porch and rested the can by her feet. She fished in her jacket pocket and found her key. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house felt quiet. She could smell old wood and stale coffee. She shut the door and slid the simple latch into place. Her knees ached from the walk, but she forced herself to the kitchen, where a beige telephone hung on the wall. She picked up the receiver and listened. The dial tone buzzed softly in her ear. She remembered an old number, one she had not dialed in years. It belonged to a man named Jack, another veteran she had once known. She pressed the numbers slowly. The phone rang and rang, but no one picked up. She waited, tried again, and got the same silence. She muttered a curse under her breath and hung up. She tried a neighbor next door, a man named George. He rarely spoke to her, but maybe he would help. She dialed his number. After 3 rings, he answered, sounding annoyed. "Hello?" he said. "George, it's Martha," she said. "I need a little help. I ran into some men at the gas station. They wouldn't let me buy kerosene. I just need—" "Martha, I can't get involved," George cut in. She heard him lower his voice. "They're dangerous. I'm sorry. I have a family." Martha gripped the receiver tightly. "I'm old," she said. "I'm alone. I can't deal with these men on my own." "I know," George said quietly, "but I can't help you. Don't mention my name to anyone." He hung up. Martha stood still, holding the silent receiver. She felt tension in her shoulders. She slammed the phone back onto the cradle. She tried another neighbor. No one answered. She tried another number. Busy. She tried the police station. A thin, bored voice answered, "Riverstone Police. What's the issue?" Martha took a breath. "I need help," she said. She tried to keep it calm and clear. "I ran into 3 men at the gas station on Pine Street. They blocked my way. They spilled oil. They refused to let me buy kerosene. They intimidated me. I'm an old woman. I need some assistance." The line crackled. The voice sighed. "Ma'am, did they harm you physically?" "They threatened me," Martha said. "They treated me like dirt." "Did they assault you?" the officer asked, sounding impatient. Martha hesitated. "They blocked my path. They spilled oil to make me slip. Isn't that enough?" "Ma'am, they didn't actually hurt you, right? No physical harm?" Martha clenched her teeth. "I left before they could. They acted like they owned the place. I felt unsafe." "Look, we know the group," the officer said. "We've had complaints, but nothing sticks. If they didn't harm you, we can't make an arrest. We don't want to escalate. Try another station. Try to stay out of their way." Martha's heart sank. "So you won't help me?" "Not much we can do, ma'am." The line clicked dead. Martha hung up and stood in her kitchen. She wanted to scream, but she stayed quiet. The air felt thick. She placed her palms on the counter and leaned forward, breathing slowly. She glanced at the small picture frames on the shelf. Most of the people in them were gone now. She thought again of Jack, who had once told her to call if she ever needed backup. She tried his number again. Still no answer. She limped to the living room and sat in an old armchair. She stared at the wall for a while, then got up and looked out the window. The street appeared normal. A car drove by, slowing for the corner. A woman walked a small dog. Martha wondered if anyone had seen her struggle at the gas station. If they had, no one came forward now. She decided to try the neighbor on the other side, a woman named Tracy. She did not know her well, but maybe a kind word would help. She stepped outside and walked along the short, uneven path to Tracy's house. She knocked softly on the door. For a moment, no sound came from inside. Then she heard light steps. The door opened a crack. "Martha?" Tracy's voice was quiet. She looked nervous. "I'm sorry to bother you," Martha said. "I ran into trouble with some men at the gas station. They wouldn't let me buy kerosene. I just need someone to maybe call the police with me, or go to the station with me. I can't handle this alone." Tracy glanced behind her as if checking who might listen. "Martha, I've heard of these men. They're part of a biker group. They cause trouble, and the police don't do much." She lowered her voice. "I have kids. I can't afford to make them angry." Martha's lips tightened. "I understand, but—" "Martha, please," Tracy said. "I can't help you with this. I'm sorry." She closed the door gently. Martha stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door. She returned to her house, moving slowly. She sat down at her kitchen table and rested her hands on her lap. She felt heavy and hollow. She had tried the police, neighbors, old contacts. No one would help. She took another look at the phone. She picked it up and tried a veterans organization number she still remembered. The line rang, and a young man answered. She explained her situation quickly. "Ma'am, I'm sorry," he said. "I don't find a record of a Jack from Vietnam who still lives in this area. Our records are limited. We can't send assistance. Maybe contact local authorities." Martha thanked him and hung up. She sat there, staring at the worn linoleum floor. She had hit a dead end. It seemed that no one would step in. She felt an ache in her chest. She thought of the war again. Back then, at least she had others around her, soldiers who had each other's backs. Now it felt like everyone looked away. She pressed her palms into her knees and tried to stand tall, but the pain made her sit again. She rubbed her aching joints. She took a sip of lukewarm water from the faucet. She had to accept that help was not coming. She was on her own. She felt a quiet anger rising. She wanted respect, but got none. She wanted safety, but found only fear and silence. Martha took a slow breath and exhaled. She still had no kerosene. She still had no answers. She listened to the distant hum of a motorcycle somewhere far away. She wondered if the men would come again. She wondered if she would find the strength to stand up to them. Martha slept poorly. She woke before dawn and walked stiffly to the front door. She unlatched it and stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked under her weight. She glanced around. The air felt cool. There was a slight smell of damp wood. As her eyes adjusted, she noticed a small red mark on the door's lower panel. It looked like it had been painted quickly. A smear of red, a warning sign. She leaned closer, her hand shaking slightly. It resembled a crude letter or symbol. She guessed it was from those men. They wanted to remind her they had not forgotten. She pressed her lips together. She did not panic. She just felt a dull ache behind her eyes. She stepped back inside, locked the door, and decided to try one more time to call someone. She picked up the phone and dialed the police again. The phone rang several times. Finally, a tired voice answered. "Riverstone Police," the voice said. "It's Martha Johnson," Martha said. "They left a mark on my door. They're threatening me." She waited, holding the receiver tight, hoping for a real response this time. The officer sighed softly. "Ma'am, do you know who left the mark?" Martha's jaw clenched. It must have been those bikers, the same men at the gas station. "Can you identify them?" "I know what they look like," Martha said, frustration showing in her voice. "I told you yesterday. They call themselves something like dark hounds. They blocked my way at the station." The officer hesitated. "Did they threaten you directly? Did they say they would harm you?" "They spilled oil and wouldn't let me buy kerosene. Now there's a mark on my door. Isn't that enough?" "Ma'am, I understand it's upsetting," the officer said. "We can take a report if you come down to the station, but there's not much else." Martha cut him off. "I'm old and can't stand around waiting for them to make their move." Her voice trembled slightly. "I need some protection here." "Ma'am, we'll note your complaint," the officer said, "but without solid evidence of a crime in progress, we can't just send a patrol. We're short-staffed. I'm sorry." Martha hung up without saying goodbye. She took a seat at the kitchen table. The words of the officer echoed in her mind. No one would come. No one cared enough to challenge these men. She pressed her hands together, feeling the rough skin of her palms. She decided to try one more neighbor. There was an older couple down the street, Ed and Susan Parker. Maybe they would listen. She walked outside, checking the street for any sign of motorcycles. Nothing yet. She walked slowly, taking short steps. Her knees felt tight. She reached the Parkers' front porch and knocked lightly. Susan Parker answered. She looked tired and nervous. "Martha," she said, "what's going on?" Martha cleared her throat. "There are some men causing trouble," she said. "They threatened me at the gas station. Now I found a mark on my door. I tried calling the police. They won't help. I need someone who will at least stand by me when I talk to them. Maybe if I show I'm not alone, they'll back off." Susan looked away for a second. She opened the door a bit more, and Martha saw Ed standing behind her. He shook his head. Susan turned back to Martha. "We know about them," Susan said softly. "They've been around for months. They do what they want. If we help you, they might come after us too." Martha pressed her lips together. "I understand you're scared. So am I. But I can't do this alone." Susan's eyes darted to Ed. He gave another silent shake of his head. Susan's voice was barely above a whisper. "Martha, I'm sorry, but we have grandchildren who visit. We can't get involved. It's too risky." Martha nodded and turned away without another word. She walked back to her house, feeling each step like a small defeat. She entered and locked the door behind her. She crossed her arms and leaned against the wall. Her breathing felt shallow. The silence pressed down on her. She listened for any sound outside, but heard nothing except a distant dog barking. She tried calling one more veterans group, one she found listed in a faded directory at the back of a drawer. The phone rang, and a friendly-sounding woman answered. Martha explained her problem quickly, asked if they could send anyone, even just one person, to talk to these men or accompany her to the gas station. The woman apologized and said their group focused on housing grants and medical claims. They did not intervene in personal disputes. Martha thanked her and hung up. She realized she was running out of ideas. No neighbors, no friends, no police, no veterans. Everyone had turned away. She sat on the floor next to her couch, feeling the rough fabric against her shoulder. She looked around her living room. It was small and plain. She owned a few items of old furniture, a few dishes, some tools in the back room. She had her memories and her pride. That was all. She thought back to the gas station. The smell of oil and gasoline still lingered in her mind. The way Hammer looked at her, confident and amused. He had not needed to say much. His presence and his actions had shown he considered her nothing but an easy target. She had nothing to stop him. She had hoped for backup, but no one would come. She got up and walked into her small bedroom. She opened a drawer and took out a simple photo. It showed her standing next to a younger man in a uniform. Jack, long ago. He had promised her once, in a letter, that if she ever needed him, he would be there. But that was before life pulled them apart. Now the phone calls went unanswered. She placed the photo back in the drawer. She returned to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water. She drank it slowly, feeling the cool liquid slide down her throat. She decided to accept the truth. She was alone in this. She had tried everything. The police refused to act. The neighbors feared for their own safety. There was no hero waiting to appear. She stood at the window and watched a single car drive by. The driver looked straight ahead, unaware of her troubles. She thought of going back to the station for kerosene, but that would be foolish now. The men were likely waiting for her to try again. She knew she would have to find another way. She might have to give up on it, at least for now. She felt tired, drained. She moved to the living room and sat in her armchair. She rested her head against the backrest and closed her eyes for a moment. She did not know what to do next. The only thing she knew was that no one was going to step in. She would have to face this alone if it came to that. The day moved forward, hour by hour. She made a small meal, ate in silence, and cleaned up after herself. She stared at the phone again but did not pick it up. There was no point. Her resources were gone. She would have to rely on herself. She stayed in that chair as evening approached, thinking about the next step, preparing herself for whatever might come. Martha spent most of the evening sitting in her armchair. Outside, the light faded. The house smelled stale. She stood up and moved to the kitchen. She ran water over her hands and dried them on a thin towel. Her knees felt stiff, but she forced herself to keep moving. She opened her back door and stepped onto the small porch. The yard was bare except for a tiny shed. She could see the outline of trees behind the fence. She heard distant traffic and a single dog barking somewhere far away. She wondered if the bikers would come here. She wondered if they would force their way in. She had little left to rely on. Her neighbors would not step forward. The police had made it clear that they would not help. She looked at her hands. They were old and bony. She could see veins under thin skin. She was not strong like she once was, but she still had a pulse. She still had anger and a sense of right and wrong. She opened the shed door. Inside were a few old tools, some scrap metal, a box of nails, and some coiled wire. She picked up a piece of wire and tested its strength with her fingers. It was tough enough to stretch across her back gate. If someone pushed against it, it would rattle or even scratch them. She could set a crude alarm. It would not stop anyone, but it might warn her. She dragged an old wooden crate closer to the gate and tied the wire low to the ground, making sure it was tight. She stepped back and tested it by tugging lightly. It made a thin, metallic sound. Good enough, she thought. She placed a few metal cans on the crate. If someone tried to climb over, the cans would fall and make noise. Martha remembered how, in the war, she had improvised bandages from torn shirts and sticks as splints. Back then, she had to do a lot with very little. Now, she had to protect her home with scraps. She moved slowly, but kept going. She found an old piece of pipe and propped it near her door. If the men came, maybe she could swing it once. She knew it was risky. They could be armed, they could be stronger. But what choice did she have? She returned inside and locked the door. She checked the latch twice. She walked into the living room, pulled a small table closer to the window, and placed a chair behind it. This position would let her watch the yard without standing directly in front of the window. She would have cover if they tried to break in. It felt strange to think this way, but she had no allies. She had to rely on herself. "Come on, Martha," she said softly to herself. "You've done harder things before." Her voice sounded steady. There was no one to hear her words but herself. She accepted that truth. No neighbors would come running. No patrol car would arrive at her door. She stood alone against these men who saw her as easy prey. She considered calling the gas station owner, but she doubted it would help. They probably feared the bikers too. She considered calling random numbers, but that was pointless. She needed to stay focused. She had to rely on what she could control, which was her home. She paced through her rooms, checking doors and windows. Everything was old and creaked. She had no alarms, no security cameras, nothing but simple locks and thin doors. She decided to push a heavy cabinet in front of the back door. It took time, and her knees hurt, but she managed to move it enough to block easy entry. She slid a small table in front of the window near the kitchen. It made things cramped, but safer. It felt strange to prepare like this. She was not a criminal or a vigilante. She was just trying to hold on to what little she had. She took a break, sat down at her kitchen table, and drank some water. Her heartbeat was steady now. She breathed quietly. She listened for sounds outside. It was mostly quiet. She heard a car pass, then silence. She thought of the men. She pictured Hammer's face. He had looked at her like she was nothing. She wanted to show him he was wrong. Even if she could not scare them away forever, she could at least make them regret thinking she was an easy target. She tapped her fingers on the table. She felt tired but alert. She would stay up tonight and watch. If they came, she would be ready. She considered leaving town, but she had nowhere to go. Her resources were limited. She had to stand her ground. She stood up and went back to the living room. She placed a sturdy old cane within reach, near her chair. She would use it if needed. She did not want to fight, but she would not let them humiliate her again. As night fell completely, she turned off most of the lights and left only a small lamp glowing in the hall. She wanted to see outside without being seen easily. She sat in the chair and stared at the window. Outside, she could see shapes of bushes and the outline of the gate. Nothing moved. The minutes crawled by. Each small sound made her tense. She heard the wind rustle leaves. She heard a distant siren that faded quickly. She thought about the phone and the silence on the other end. No one would help her. She must accept that. She ran a hand over her face, felt the lines and wrinkles. She was alive. She was here. That was enough for now. She gripped the cane and tapped it lightly on the floor. The sound was dull and hollow. She would not run and hide. She would not beg. If they returned, they would find a woman who refused to surrender quietly. She might be old, but she was not dead yet. She sat there, listening and waiting, ready to face whatever came next. Martha sat in the chair for what felt like hours. The night stretched on. She heard faint sounds outside, but nothing too close. Her legs felt cramped. She stood, stretched, and walked to the kitchen. She poured a small glass of water, drank it, and wiped her mouth. She checked the back door again, pressed on the cabinet to ensure it was tight against the frame. She whispered to herself, "I did what I could." Her voice sounded steady. She tried to think of anything else she might use as a defense. She had a few old tools in a drawer near the sink, a rusty screwdriver and a small hammer. Not much good in a real fight, but it was better than empty hands. She returned to the living room and sat again. She considered the possibility that they might wait until morning to come back. Maybe they wanted her to worry all night. Maybe they would try to scare her into leaving town. She was not leaving. She had nowhere to go. This was her home. She stared at the window and listened to her own breathing. The phone rang suddenly. The sound made her jump. She stood up and hurried to the kitchen, picking up the receiver. "Hello?" she said, voice tense. Silence for a moment, then a male voice. "Martha?" It sounded old but familiar. "Martha, it's Roy from down the street." Roy had lived in the area for years. He rarely talked to her, but she recognized his voice. He sounded uneasy. "What is it, Roy?" Martha asked, gripping the phone. "I heard about what happened," Roy said softly. "I saw those men at the gas station earlier today. Are you all right?" Martha's heart beat faster. At least someone had reached out. "I'm managing," she said. "They won't let me buy kerosene. They threatened me. I tried calling the police. No one will step in. Everyone's scared." Roy sighed into the phone. "Yeah, they've been causing trouble. They're part of that biker group. They don't mess with everyone, just people they think won't fight back. I'm sorry, Martha. I can't do much myself, but I wanted to see if you're still okay." Martha appreciated the gesture, even if it was small. "Thanks, Roy," she said. "I'm fine. I've done what I can here. Locked my doors, set up a noise trap in the yard. I'm old, but I won't just roll over." Roy paused. "I understand. Just be careful. They might try something tonight. If I hear anything, I'll call." Martha nodded, knowing he couldn't see her. "Thanks, Roy." She hung up, feeling slightly less alone. She stood by the phone for a moment before returning to the living room. Back in her chair, she tapped her cane on the floor. At least Roy cared enough to check in. but he still wouldn't come over or stand with her. She understood. These men scared everyone. She watched the window again, waiting for any sign of movement. Time passed slowly. She wondered if they would show up soon. Her heart thumped each time she thought she heard something. Then, close to midnight, she heard a muffled sound near her back fence. She stood up, careful not to knock anything over, and moved closer to the window. She listened. The sound came again, a soft metallic clink. The wire? Maybe someone touched it. She reached for the cane and held it like a bat. Her hands felt sweaty. She moved quietly through the small house until she stood near the back door. She placed her ear against it. She heard low voices outside. It sounded like two people. She could not make out their words. She stayed still and tried not to breathe too loudly. A muffled curse outside. A can rattled. Her trap worked. She heard someone whisper, "What the hell?" Another voice said, "Shut up. Keep it down." Martha pressed her lips together. They were trying to be quiet. Maybe they thought she would be asleep. She was not asleep. She was ready. She considered shouting through the door, but decided against it. They might know she was awake, but she did not want to give away her exact position inside. She moved slowly to one side of the door. She gripped the cane tightly. If they forced the door open, they would face her. She was not strong, but she would strike fast if needed. More rattling outside. She heard one of them say in a low voice, "This old bag set something up." Another voice, a bit louder, said, "Screw this. Let's just break in." Martha's heart sped up. She braced herself. The doorknob rattled. She had locked it. She had blocked it. She hoped it would hold. The door creaked slightly as they pushed, but the cabinet inside helped keep it shut. "It's stuck," one of them muttered. Martha crouched a bit, ready to swing. The men pushed harder. The door did not budge easily. She heard a fist thump against it. "Damn it," one said. "What is she doing in there?" Another replied, "I don't know. Maybe we should come back with more guys." The first one sounded annoyed. "We look stupid. It's just an old lady." Martha's arms trembled from tension. She wanted them to leave. She hoped they would give up. She said nothing, just waited. After a few more attempts, she heard footsteps moving away from the door. A slight scraping sound at the gate. The cans rattled again. Then silence. Martha waited several minutes before moving. She stood there, breathing slowly, listening for their return. Nothing. She slowly relaxed her grip on the cane. She had not needed to strike. Her simple traps and locked door had held them off. She felt relieved but still alert. They might try another angle. She stepped back to the living room window, looked out, and saw nothing. She thought about calling Roy back, but what good would it do? He could not chase them away. She thought about calling the police again, but they would say the same thing. Instead, she just sat down and caught her breath. She had made them hesitate. That counted for something. She pulled the small lamp closer and checked the time. Past midnight. She would stay awake. She felt tired, but her determination kept her going. They had tested her home. They had failed to scare her into opening the door. Maybe they would realize she was not as easy a target as they thought. Martha decided to move to the kitchen and get more water. As she stood by the sink, she heard a motorcycle engine in the distance. It grew louder, then faded again. She felt a knot in her stomach. She knew they would not give up easily. But at least tonight, she had stopped them from entering. She hoped that would count for something in their twisted minds. She returned to the living room, sat in the chair, and kept watch. She would protect herself. She had no choice. Martha waited through the rest of the night, her body stiff and tense. She stayed in the chair by the window, the cane resting against her leg. Outside, it remained quiet. No one tried the door again. She counted the hours until dawn. When the sky began to lighten, she stood and stretched her sore muscles. She limped to the kitchen and drank some water. She was tired and hungry. She moved the furniture away from the back door and opened it carefully. She saw the wire pulled loose and the cans scattered on the ground. The gate stood slightly ajar. She stepped outside, holding the cane. The yard smelled damp. She checked for footprints and saw a few smudges in the dirt near the fence. She picked up the cans and the wire, tossing them into a corner. She had shown them she was not easy prey. She hoped it would make them think twice. She went back inside and locked the door. She took a seat and rubbed her knees. Her phone rang unexpectedly, and she hurried to answer it. "Hello?" she said, voice tense. "Martha, it's Roy again." He sounded worried. "I heard some noise last night. Everything okay?" Martha looked around her kitchen. "They tried to get in, but they didn't succeed," she said. "I set up a few things. They gave up after a bit." Roy's voice lowered. "I'm glad you're all right. Those guys don't like being challenged." "I know," Martha said. "I'm not going anywhere. I just want to live in peace." Roy sounded uneasy. "The police won't do anything, Martha. We both know that. These men pay off people, or they scare them enough to keep quiet." Martha felt a knot in her stomach. She had already faced that reality. "I see," she said. "They want me to roll over, but I won't. If they try again, I'll stand my ground." "I get it," Roy said. "But be careful. Maybe they'll leave you alone now. Maybe they'll back off." Martha nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "Thanks for calling, Roy." She hung up. She spent the morning moving slowly through her house, checking doors and windows. She couldn't live forever in fear. She had to do something. She considered going back to the gas station when it was quiet, maybe early in the morning or late at night, to buy kerosene without trouble. But what if they found out? She needed a plan, but she had no allies and no weapons worth mentioning. She walked to her bedroom and opened a box she kept in the closet. Inside were old letters, a few medals from her service, and a pocket knife. The knife's blade was dull, but it could still cut if pressed hard. She slipped it into her jacket pocket. She didn't plan to use it unless she had no choice. After breakfast, she decided to step outside again and check the street. She walked to the front porch and looked around. The neighborhood looked normal. A car passed by. A mail carrier stopped at a box down the block. No one seemed to pay attention to her house. She considered walking to another gas station a few streets away, one that might not attract these bikers. But her legs hurt, and she did not want to be caught off guard on an open road. She sat on her porch, the cane resting beside her. She listened to distant engines and watched a few people go about their day. She wondered if the men would return at night. Maybe not. Maybe they realized she was not as weak as they thought. She hoped so. She had no desire to fight, but if they pushed her, she would do what she had to do. As the afternoon wore on, she stayed mostly inside, watching from the windows. She noticed fewer neighbors on the street. Maybe they were afraid too. Maybe everyone knew the bikers were around, watching. The silence weighed on her. Still, no one offered to stand with her. She accepted that. In the late afternoon, the phone rang again. She answered it quickly, expecting Roy. "Hey, old lady," said a rough voice. She recognized it at once. It was Hammer's voice. "Heard you put up some tricks last night. That's cute." Martha gripped the phone tightly. "I'm busy," she said. Her heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. "You think you're tough?" Hammer asked. She heard a muffled laugh. "We're not done. You can't run to anyone. We own this place." Martha clenched her jaw. "I'm not scared of you," she said simply. Hammer chuckled. "We'll see about that. Maybe we'll come back tonight, see if you got more surprises. Or maybe we'll wait until you sleep. You can't stay awake forever." Martha forced herself to keep her voice level. "You talk too much. If you want to try something, go ahead. I'm here." She hung up without waiting for a response. Her hands shook as she placed the phone down. She took a deep breath. They were angry now, and she had shown she would not bow. Night would come soon. She had to prepare again. She went outside and rearranged the wire at the gate. She placed the cans in a different spot. She moved a small wooden board near the fence. Inside, she made sure doors were locked and furniture was placed to block entry points. She turned off most lights and kept a lamp glowing in the hall. She took out the pocket knife and placed it on the kitchen table, easily reachable. She sat in the living room with her cane and waited, just like the night before. Her body felt heavy, but her mind stayed sharp. She knew they might come again, and this time they might bring more men. She had to show them she was not an easy target, no matter her age or size. As the sun went down, the quiet deepened. She listened carefully. If they came, she would fight back. If they forced their way in, she would make them regret it. She did not know what would happen after that, but she would not hand them her dignity. She waited, ready for anything. Martha sat quietly in her chair, the cane resting across her knees. She kept the house dark again. She watched the window, listening for sounds outside. The night air felt still. She heard nothing at first, just distant traffic. Around midnight, she thought she heard footsteps near the fence. She picked up the cane and moved slowly toward the back door. She placed her ear against it, holding her breath. Voices murmured on the other side. More than two this time. She heard at least 3 men. They sounded irritated, muttering curses as if arguing about what to do next. She gripped the cane tighter. She remembered Hammer's voice on the phone. He had promised to return. She waited for them to make a move. The wire rattled again. She heard one of them whisper. She set it up again. Another voice said, "Just kick it aside." Metal cans clanked as they fell to the ground. Martha's heart pounded. They were bolder tonight. She moved a table slightly to block the kitchen door, then stood behind it with her cane raised. She had locked everything, but if they were determined, a lock might not hold forever. A hand tried the doorknob. Then a shoulder hit the door. The cabinet inside rattled. The door did not open easily. She heard Hammer's voice now, low and angry. "Push harder." The door shook under their weight. Martha felt the table tremble slightly. She decided to speak. She raised her voice just enough to carry through the wood. "Get out," she said. Her tone was firm. "You're wasting your time." They stopped for a second, surprised by her voice. She heard someone laugh bitterly. "You think you can keep us out all night?" a voice called. "You're an old woman. Open the door." Martha stayed silent, except for her breathing. She would not open the door. She would not give them an inch. She shifted the cane in her hands, ready to swing if they somehow forced their way inside. Another heavy thud against the door. The wood creaked. She imagined them kicking at it, trying to break it down. She pressed her shoulder against the table to brace it. Her knees hurt, but she ignored the pain. She had to focus. "Come on!" Hammer's voice rose, frustrated. "This is stupid. It's just some old lady." She heard scuffling outside, like they were trying to find another way in. She held her breath and listened carefully. They moved along the side of the house, tapping on windows, testing for weaknesses. She had locked everything, blocked everything. A faint crack of glass from a small window in the bathroom. Martha's eyes widened. That window was high and small, but maybe one could squeeze through. She hurried to that room, limping quickly, and grabbed a broomstick. She shoved it under the window latch, holding it in place. She waited, hearing their muffled curses as they realized how cramped and secure it was. "They've got this place locked down," someone said outside, irritated. "This is taking too long." "Shut up," Hammer barked. "We'll get in. Just keep pushing." Martha returned to the kitchen, pressing herself against the table again. She waited. The door shook a few more times. They tried crowbars or something metal. She heard scraping. Her arms trembled, but she held steady. She imagined them growing tired or annoyed. They wanted an easy victim. She was not easy. She would never be easy again. Minutes passed. The doorframe groaned under pressure, but it held. She heard them cursing, complaining that it was too much work. She allowed herself a small, silent moment of relief. They were not unstoppable. They might give up if it got too hard. One of them shouted through the door, "You think you're smart? You think this changes anything? We'll find you again, on the street when you step out. We'll be waiting." Martha's jaw tightened. She knew they wanted to scare her, but she did not respond. She just kept holding the table. She listened as their voices moved away slightly. Maybe they were checking the front door now. She had blocked that too. There was no easy entrance. She crept toward the living room and listened at the front door. Footsteps on the porch. A dull thud as someone tested it. It held firm. Another curse. Another few tries. Still no luck. She heard them mumble, "This is ridiculous. She's got everything locked up." Hammer's voice sounded closer again. "We'll leave for now," he said, sounding defeated but also furious. "But we're not done. She can't stay locked in forever." Martha stood still, waiting for them to actually leave. She heard footsteps retreating, the gate squeaking as they slipped out. A minute later, faint sounds of motorcycles starting up in the distance. She stayed where she was, breathing slowly, until the night fell silent again. She lowered the cane and walked to the kitchen table, leaning against it. She felt sweat on her forehead. Her shoulders ached. She had held them off again. They were angry now, and they threatened to catch her outside. They were determined. She knew they would not forget this easily. But for now, she had peace. She moved some furniture back into place and checked the doors. She ran her hand over the doorframe, feeling the dents where they tried to break in. It held, at least for tonight. She considered her next move. She could not stay locked up forever, as they said. She would need supplies eventually. She needed kerosene. She needed groceries. She could not call anyone for help. The police would not protect her. The neighbors would not stand up to these men. She sat down in her chair and kept watch for another hour, just in case. Nothing happened. The night passed. In the early morning, she finally allowed herself to rest. She closed her eyes for a moment, cane still in hand. She would have to find a way to handle this. But at least she survived another night. Martha woke up with a dull ache in her joints. She had not slept well, but she had rested enough to move around. The morning light came through the windows. She stood in her kitchen and looked at the damaged doorframe. She ran her finger over the marks left by their attempts to break in. She felt tired, but also angry. They had failed twice now. That mattered. She decided to check the outside again. She moved the table, unlatched the door, and stepped onto the porch. The air felt cool. She saw footprints in the dirt, broken cans scattered on the ground, and the gate partially open. She walked slowly, picking up the cans and placing them in a small pile beside the fence. She noticed that some of the wires she had set up were bent. They had tried hard to get inside. Back inside, she sat at her table and thought about her next step. She needed kerosene. She also needed a plan. She could not spend every night holding them off. She had to show them that she would not live in fear, but also she knew they were persistent. The phone rang. She picked it up. "Hello?" she said. "Martha, it's Roy," came the voice on the other end. He sounded cautious. "I heard noise again last night. Are you okay?" "They tried again," Martha said. "They didn't get in." Roy took a deep breath. "They're stubborn. Look, I know the police won't help. Maybe you can leave for a while. Stay with someone else." "I have no one, Roy," she said flatly. "This is my house." Roy hesitated. "I'm sorry," he said. "I wish I could do more." Martha hung up after a brief goodbye. She appreciated Roy's concern, but he offered no real solution. She sat there for a while, then decided to try something else. Maybe she could call the gas station owner. She looked up the number in an old phone book. She dialed and waited. A middle-aged man answered. "This is Tom at Pine Gas," he said. "This is Martha Johnson," she said. "I had trouble buying kerosene at your station a couple of days ago. Some men blocked me. They belong to that biker group." Tom sighed loudly. "Yeah, I've seen them around. They make trouble. I'm sorry, ma'am, but there's not much I can do. They don't pay. They just stand around, act tough, scare customers. If I ask them to leave, they break something. The police won't step in." "I need kerosene," Martha said. "I'm old, but I can pay. I just need a chance to fill my can." Tom was silent for a moment. "If you come right now, maybe they're not here. Sometimes they come in the afternoon. I can't promise anything." Martha considered the risk. Daylight gave her some safety. She could try to slip in and out quickly, She was tired of waiting, and she needed that fuel. She thanked Tom and hung up. She put on her jacket, took her cane, and stepped outside. She walked slowly down the dusty street. Each step made her knees ache, but she kept going. She watched carefully for any sign of the bikers. She saw no motorcycles, no men leaning against fences. It felt quiet. When she reached the gas station, Tom stood behind the register inside. Martha walked over to the kerosene pump and checked around. No one bothered her. She filled her can and paid inside. Tom gave her a slight nod. "Good luck, ma'am," he said. "Be careful." Martha nodded and left. As she walked back home, she kept glancing over her shoulder. She expected to see them following her. She saw no one at first. Then, just before she reached her block, she heard an engine. She looked back and spotted one motorcycle pulling out of a side street. It rolled slowly in her direction. She gripped the can tightly and kept walking. The motorcycle caught up and stopped a few feet behind her. A young man with a shaved head stared at her, saying nothing. She recognized him from the gas station. She turned to face him. "You got a problem?" she said, holding her cane steady. He narrowed his eyes but did not answer. He revved the engine once, as if to show off his power. Martha stood firm. After a few tense seconds, the man turned and rode off without a word. She watched him go, then continued toward her house. When she reached her front porch, she went inside and locked the door. She set the kerosene can on the kitchen counter and breathed a sigh of relief. She had what she needed. She had managed to do it without being stopped. But she knew this might trigger another response from them. She had faced them down, resisted their entry, and now managed to get her supplies without their permission. All day she waited in her house, listening carefully. She considered ways to strengthen her doors even more. She moved a heavy dresser to block a window from inside. She nailed a piece of plywood across a small back window. She made sure the knife was close at hand. She expected them to try something again. Hammer would not let this slide. By evening, she remained alert. She prepared a simple meal and ate quickly. She kept the lights low. She listened for engines. At dusk, she heard a few motorcycles pass by the street, but they did not stop. She wondered if they would wait until late again. She decided she would not sleep much tonight. She would do what she had done before. She would defend her home. The hours passed slowly. She stayed near the back door, cane in hand. She thought of how simple her life had been before these men showed up. She had always been alone, but at least no one threatened her. Now she had to live like this, always watching, always ready. It was exhausting, but she would not give up. Near midnight, she thought she heard voices outside again. She pressed her ear to the door and caught a few words. They were arguing quietly. She recognized Hammer's voice. He said something about showing her who was in charge. She felt the door push slightly. They were testing it again. Martha held her breath, bracing herself. Would this night be different? Would they break through this time? She stood tall, ready to fight back. She had resisted before. She would do it again. This time, she promised herself, if they forced their way in, she would not be kind. She waited, her muscles tense, listening for the next move. Martha stood with her cane in hand, breathing through her nose and waiting. The men outside whispered and cursed. They pressed on the door again, testing the strength of the lock and the furniture she had placed behind it. She heard one of them say, "It's too much trouble." Another insisted, "We can't let her win." She remained quiet, not giving them the satisfaction of a response. They tried the windows again, rattling the frames and muttering angry words. Martha kept close watch. She stayed near the kitchen, ready to defend herself if they got in. She knew they had more than one man tonight. She could hear at least 3 voices. They struggled with her makeshift barricades, swearing and coughing as they moved around the perimeter. A scraping sound at the bathroom window made Martha spin around, holding her cane at shoulder height. The small window was boarded from the inside. The intruder outside pushed and pulled but made little progress. A muffled voice said, "This old woman is crazy." Another told him to be quiet and keep trying. Martha's heart pounded. She kept steady, her knuckles white around the cane. She stepped toward the back door and listened. They were attempting to pry it open with a tool. The wood creaked, but did not give way. She pressed her shoulder against the furniture she had piled there. She would not let them through easily. They moved to the front door again. Martha followed quietly. She leaned in and heard their frustration. "This place is locked up like a bank," someone growled. "She's in there waiting for us. I can feel it." Hammer's voice cut in, low and angry. "We have a reputation. We can't let her show us up." Martha inhaled slowly and exhaled through her mouth. She remembered their laughter at the gas station. Now their tone had changed. They sounded irritated and uncertain. Their easy confidence had faded. They did not expect this level of resistance from one old woman. The men banged on the front door, harder this time. Wood chips fell to the floor inside. Martha winced at the damage but kept quiet. She gripped the cane and braced herself. If they broke through, she would have only a moment to act. She felt her heart racing, but she refused to run or hide. Suddenly, a loud crash outside startled everyone. It sounded like something heavy falling over near the fence. The men cursed and scrambled. Maybe they knocked something down in their hurry. Martha heard them arguing, their voices rising. One demanded they keep trying. Another said this was a waste of time. Hammer hissed, "Shut up," but his voice had lost its earlier control. Martha took a step back and waited. The front door shook again, but no one forced it open. She listened closely. Footsteps moved away from the porch. They talked among themselves, their words muffled. She caught phrases like, "not worth it," and "we'll get caught." Hammer barked orders, but no one sounded eager to continue. Minutes passed. The house fell quiet again. Martha stayed put, not moving from her spot. She strained her ears for any sign of them returning to the back door. Nothing happened. No more banging, no more scraping. The silence stretched on. Finally, Martha heard one of them say, "Screw this." Another mumbled something she could not understand. Then the sound of heavy footsteps moving away. She pressed her ear closer to the door and caught the faint noise of motorcycles starting up. Engines revved softly, then faded into the distance. She waited a full 5 minutes before letting herself breathe normally. She carefully unblocked the door and peeked through a crack in the curtains. The yard looked empty. The gate stood open, and her makeshift traps lay scattered. No figures lingered in the shadows. Martha stepped back into the kitchen, still holding the cane. Her body shook from tension. She felt sweat on her forehead. She understood now that they had finally given up. They had tested her patience and strength night after night, and each time she refused to yield. It had not been easy, and she knew the damage to her home would not vanish. But they had left her house intact and left her alive. She placed the cane on the table, sat down, and rubbed her sore knees. She felt a strange relief and something like quiet pride. She had stood her ground. They had tried force and threats, and it had not worked. Martha knew they might still appear on the streets, but they would no longer see her as an easy victim. She had denied them the pleasure of breaking her will. She walked slowly through the house, checking windows and doors. Everything was locked, though damaged. She would need to fix some things, but that could wait until morning. Right now, she wanted to rest. She fetched a glass of water and drank it slowly, then returned to the living room. She eased herself into her armchair and let her mind settle. The night outside remained quiet. No engines, no voices. Just the soft hum of distant traffic and the creaking of old wood as the house settled. Martha understood that nothing had magically improved in the world outside. The police would still not help. The neighbors would still stay silent. But she had defended what was hers, alone. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the ache in her limbs, feeling the tension leave her muscles. Tomorrow she would clean up, straighten the furniture, maybe get some better locks. She would manage. She always had. She always would. No applause greeted her victory. No one would write a story about it. But she knew what had happened here. She had refused to be a victim. That was enough. She opened her eyes and looked around her small living room. Everything seemed the same as before, just a bit more worn. She had changed, though. She had proven something to herself. She stood up, leaning on the cane for support, and walked to the bedroom. She planned to sleep a bit more now. The men were gone. At least for tonight she had won.